Hello, this asynchronous lecture is going to be talking about Orientalism and its definition along with its critique. Now, before we begin along the lines of what a definition of Orientalism is and what were the concepts associated with it and how did it develop in history and then what was the critique that was aimed at it, we have to talk a little bit about Edward Said, who is considered to be the forerunner of this particular text. Now, Edward Said was a man who was not just an academic scholar, he was a Palestinian scholar, and he was raised in different parts of the world. He also went to university in Princeton and Harvard, and he's credited to be a philosopher of the 20th century, and his areas include continental philosophy, post-colonialism, Western philosophy, and the ideas of Occidentalism, Orientalism, and the other. Edward Said was born to a businessman in Jerusalem, then which was a part of a British Mandate of Palestine, and in 1919 his father Wadi Said established a stationery business in Cairo, and that is when they started also inculcating in particular religious practices. The Said family practiced Protestantism. Edward pursued an academic career and he attended different schools and colleges across the world. In not his younger education, of course, consists of straddling the worlds of Cairo and Jerusalem. And in 1947, he attended St. George's School, Jerusalem, a British-style school whose teaching staff consisted of stern Anglicans. About being there, Said had said, with an unexceptionally Arab family name like Said, connected to an improbably British first name, Edward, I was an uncomfortably anomalous student all through my early years. A Palestinian going to school in Egypt with an English first name, an American passport, and no certain identity at all. To make matters worse, Arabic, my native language, and English, my school language, were inextricably mixed. I have never known which was my first language and have felt fully at home in neither, although I dream in both. Every time I speak an English sentence, I find myself echoing it in Arabic and vice versa. During the period of Palestinian history under the British Mandate, the function of a European-style school such as the Victoria College, where Edward's schooling took place by the late 1940s. Victoria College was to educate selections of young men from the Arab and the Levantine upper classes to become anglicized post-colonial politicians who would administer their countries upon decolonization. Now, about Victoria College, Said had said, the moment one became a student at Victoria College, one was given the student handbook, a series of regulations governing every aspect of school life, the kind of uniform we were to wear, what equipment was needed for sports, the dates of school holidays, bus schedules, and so on. But the school's first rule emblazoned on the opening page of the handbook read, English is the language of the school. Students caught speaking any other language will be punished. Yet there were no native speakers of English among the students. Whereas the masters were all British, we were a motley crew of Arabs of various kinds, Armenians, Greeks, Italians, Jews, and Turks, each of whom had a native language that the school had explicitly outlawed. Yet all of, or nearly all of us, spoke Arabic. Many spoke Arabic and French. And so we were able to take refuge in a common language, in defiance of what we perceived as an unjust colonial structure. In 1963, Said joined Columbia University as a member of the English and Comparative Literature faculties, where he taught and worked until 2003. In 1974, he was visiting professor of comparative literature at Harvard. During the 75-76 period, he was a fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Science at Stanford. Said also worked as a visiting professor at Yale University and lectured at more than 200 other universities in North America, Europe, and the Middle East. In 1992, Said was promoted to full professor. Editorially, Said served as president of the MLA, the Modern Language Association, as editor of the Arab Studies Quarterly in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, on the executive board of International PEN and the American Philosophical Society. Said's first published book, Joseph Conrad and the Fiction of Autobiography, was an expansion of the doctoral dissertation he presented to earn the PhD degree. Abdurrahman Hussain said in Edward Said, Criticism and Society, that Conrad's novella, Heart of Darkness, was foundational to Said's entire career and project. In Beginnings, Intention and Method, Said analyzed the theoretical basis of literary criticism by drawing on the insights of Vico, Valery, Nietzsche, de Saussure, Lévi-Strauss, Husserl, and Foucault. Said's later works include The World, the Text and the Critic, Nationalism, Colonialism and Literature, Yeats and Decolonization, Culture and Imperialism, Representations of the Intellectual, the 1993 Reith Lectures, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, and On Late Style. Edward Said's Orientalism has been credited with opening out the field of post-colonial studies or colonial discourse analysis because of its persistent linking together of the colonial experience with the empire and of politics with culture. It has served as an agency to the formerly marginalized peoples and has allowed the empire to write back. Orientalism was published in 1978. This work offered a critique of Oriental studies, or what is also known as the construction of knowledge by the Orient, by the West. Said's book generated a lot of hostility among scholars of the Orient who accused Said of crossing the line between arts and politics. But many who found its iconoclastic vision, or rather violation of boundaries and conventions, in unsettling, received ideas of Orient and Occident, liberating and enabling, greeted it with immense enthusiasm. What do we understand by Orientalism? Said gives us 3 definitions in the introduction to his book. It would be appropriate that we examine each definition before we attempt an overall characterization of Orientalism. Said states that the initial meaning is to be anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient, and this applies whether the person is an anthropologist, sociologist, historian, or philologist, either in its specific or its general aspects, is an Orientalist, and what he or she does is Orientalism. What is notable in this definition is the number of disciplines that Said includes in the study of Orientalism, pointing to the fact that they are all interlinked rather than separate entities. Thus, the study of humankind, the study of the origin, development, and structure of societies, the study of the past, and the study of languages obviously share a great deal of common ground, but construct different kinds of knowledge structures. Said's attempt to define Orientalism begins by transgressing academically sanctified disciplinary boundaries by claiming that academic classifications should be disregarded when their subject matter is the Orient. This takes us into the next definition, which is a more general one, though it still pertains to the academy. Said says, Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and, the most of the time, the Occident. Now, before we go on to analyzing this definition, we need to understand 2 words which are very new to us. What does ontological mean? Ontological is related to that branch of metaphysics which deals with the nature of being. In simple terms, if we think about it, ontology is the study of existence, but it is also much more than that. It is how we study and determine if things exist or not, as well as the classification of existence. It attempts to take things that are abstract and establish that they are, in fact, real. Some of the ontological arguments that we find, that we come across in particular texts and books, are the conclusion that God exists from premises which are supposed to derive from other source or some source other than the observation of the world. For example, if we are to understand or to conclude that God exists from reason alone. Some of the beliefs that are considered to be part of the system of ontology is that it reflects an interpretation of an individual about what constitutes a fact. In simple terms, ontology is associated with what we consider as reality. And some of the assumptions that we come across in this, which are considered to be ontological assumptions, which are natures of reality, is that there is one defined reality which is fixed, measurable and observable. The world exists and that is a fact. Epistemological assumptions are knowledge or related to knowledge, which consists of the concept that the genuine knowledge is objective and quantifiable, and the goal of science is to test and expand theory. In the case of psychology, ontology is that part of philosophy which deals with questions about the nature of what exists and how different aspects of being are related to each other. Therefore, we actually come across something which is the relation between different kinds of existence, different forms of existence. So therefore, ontology is the philosophical study of being in general, or of what applies neutrally to everything that is real. It was called first philosophy by Aristotle in book 4 of his Metaphysics. The Latin term ontologia, which is science of being, was also invented by the German philosopher Lorhard, and it entered general circulation after being popularized by the German rationalist philosopher Christian Wolff in his Latin writings. Once they have been brought into the open, ontological disputes tend to concentrate on questions of several recurrent kinds. The fundamental question, of course, has the form, are there X's or do X's exist? Negative answers to the fundamental questions are accompanied by attempts to explain away any appearances to the effect that there are such things. If the question is answered affirmatively, there are subsequent questions. Do X's exist independently of minds and languages, objectively, or do they depend on them in some way, subjectively or intersubjectively? Are they discovered or created? Are they basic, irreducible constituents of reality, or can they be reduced to others? For example, in the millennia-long dispute about universals, realists have affirmed mind-independent universals, whether existing apart or only in things. Conceptualists have taken universals to be mental or mind-created entities. Moderate nominalists such as Thomas Hobbes have taken them to be words or linguistic entities, and extreme nominalists have denied that there are any universalists or universals at all. Among modern Platonists, some take universals to be basic or sui generis, while others take them to be reducible to sets. Now, when we think of ontology as the science or the study of knowledge, epistemology is something which becomes very much a concern and a kind of a relative field of study. Epistemology is, in a very simple way of saying this, the theory of knowledge, especially with its regard to methods, validity, and scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion. Epistemologists study the nature, origin, and scope of knowledge, epistemic justification, the rationality of belief, and various related issues. The term epistemology comes from the Greek words epistem and logos. Epistem can be translated as knowledge or understanding or acquaintance, while logos can be translated as account or argument or reason. Just as these different translations captures some facet of the meaning of these Greek terms, so too does each translation capture a different facet of epistemology itself. The term epistemology is no more than a couple of centuries old. However, the field of epistemology is at least as old as any in philosophy. In different parts of its extensive history, different facets of epistemology have attracted attention. Plato's epistemology was an attempt to understand what it was to know and how knowledge, unlike mere true opinion, is good for the knower. Locke's epistemology was an attempt to understand the operations of human understanding. Kant's epistemology was an attempt to understand the conditions of the possibility of human understanding, and Russell's epistemology was an attempt to understand how modern science could be justified by appeal to sensory experience. Much recent work in formal epistemology is an attempt to understand how our degrees of confidence are rationally constrained by our evidence, and much recent work in feminist epistemology is an attempt to understand the ways in which interests affect our evidence and affect our rational constraints more generally. In all these cases, epistemology seeks to understand one or another kind of cognitive success or correspondingly cognitive failure. This entry surveys the varieties of cognitive success, and with this entry, it allows certain understandings of varieties of cognitive successes, varieties of cognitive failures. What are the ways in which we understand the concept of explaining things? For example, what explains what? What makes it a success? What are certain epistemic harms and epistemic wrongs? What is knowledge? What are knowing individuals? How do we know? And how do we differentiate between knowing facts and knowing things as they are for themselves? So, epistemology is to deal with knowledge, and knowledge is among the many kinds of cognitive success that epistemology is interested in understanding. Even if you know many facts about Napoleon, it doesn't follow that you know Napoleon. You couldn't ever have known Napoleon since he died long before you were born. But despite not having ever known Napoleon, you could still know a great many facts about Napoleon. Perhaps you know even more facts about Napoleon than did those who knew him most intimately. This shows that knowing a person is not the same as knowing a great many facts about the person. The latter is not sufficient for the former. And perhaps the former is not even sufficient for the latter. Since I might know my next door neighbor and yet not fully realize that he is an undercover agent and that almost everything he tells me about himself is false. Knowing a person is a matter of being acquainted with that person, and acquaintance involves some kind of perceptual relation to the person. What kind of perceptual relation? Clearly, not just any perceptual relation will do. I see and hear thousands of people while walking around a bustling city. but it doesn't follow that I am acquainted with any of them. Must acquaintance involve an ability to distinguish that individual from others? It depends on what such an ability amounts to. I am acquainted with my next door neighbor, even though in some sense I cannot distinguish him from his identical twin. If they were together, I couldn't tell who was who. So therefore, cognitive success is expressed by the verb to know with a direct object, or by the French connaître, which we have not yet understood as just being an example of meaning of a word, but also understood it as having a relation with other concepts. So when we go back to the definitions of Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. With this second definition, Said moves to a much broader area of the academy, the study of the very nature of knowledge and the study of existence itself. The parameters of the study of Orientalism then become almost limitless and open the floodgates for writers from a variety of disciplines. Poets, novelists, philosophers, political theorists, economists, and imperial administrations. So now one moves from the theoretical space of academics out into the political realm of administration. The scope of writers who can be brought into the purview of Orientalist writing extends to include creative artists and administrators as well. The internal academic boundaries that were transgressed in the first definition now take a step further to violate the boundary between academics and politics, opening up a number of possibilities for studying Orientalism. Said now moves out of the academy and its related disciplines into the world of power, authority, and control in his third meaning. This definition is located in a historical material context and articulates his thesis more clearly. Taking the late 18th century as a very roughly defined starting point, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. A corporate institution, by definition, refers to a large group of people that perform multiple functions in different fields but act as a single entity. The academy that has thus disseminated knowledge of the Orient is now replaced by a corporate institution whose function and powers are far more than the academy could ever have. Orientalism's main feature is that it constituted of the West and it deals with domination of the Orient through every socio-political institution available to it. To structure the field of Orientalism, Said uses Foucault's notion of a discourse, that is, of constituting a discursive field that is able to unite disparate materials as an area of study. Said argues that it is only by examining Orientalism as a systematic discipline that it is possible to understand that European culture has not just managed but also produced the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively. Orientalism tries to show how the West achieved this, but more important than that, it also asserts that the reason this immense project was undertaken was because Europe gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. That is, the Occident needed to produce the Orient as a means of defining itself as a superior power. Said makes one more attempt to define the enormous scope of Orientalism later in the introduction. He does not consider the institutions or the area of study or practice that can be seen as Orientalist. He looks at the methods by which it is produced and established, or the modes through which it is expressed. He defines it as a basic distribution of geopolitical awareness and elaboration not only of a geopolitical or a geographical distinction, the world is made up of two unequal halves, Orient and Occident, but also of a series of interest, a certain will or intention to understand. He concludes by clarifying his argument thus: Indeed, my real argument is that Orientalism is and does not simply represent a considerable dimension of modern political intellectual culture, and as such has less to do with the Orient than it has to do with our world. Here, Orientalism is defined as a dimension of the modern culture of the West, as manifest in its politics and academic disciplines, with the express aim to gain authority over the Orient. Having defined in and scope of Orientalism in different ways, now we move on to the way the concept of Orientalism has worked in many different fields of knowledge, and what are the concerns that are there, what are the ways and the methods that are applicable to this particular field of knowledge. We have to see how a large number of disciplines, interests, practices, and power groups function together in concert under Orientalism without a written contract. Said uses Gramsci and his idea of cultural hegemony to explain how Orientalism functions effectively. Antonio Gramsci's analysis of society distinguished between civil and political society. Gramsci argued that civil society is made up of voluntary affiliation, in which he listed schools, families, and unions. Membership to these units is voluntary, and affiliation to the influence of ideas, of institutions, and of other persons is by consent, not domination or coercion. Culture operates within civil society, and the cultural leadership that emerges through the process of some cultures dominating over others is what Gramsci calls hegemony. Said points to the Gramscian notion of cultural hegemony of the industrial West to show how Orientalism is produced and maintained in a historical socio-political context. The move from the last definition of Orientalism to Gramsci's formulation of cultural hegemony is a smooth one. Said locates the central idea that defines the culture of Europe as the idea of European identity as a superior one in comparison with all the non-European peoples and cultures. Orientalism arises out of Europe's need to identify the other over whom it can assert its superiority in a neat binary of us against them. The binary of self-other is not a static one. Orientalism's power and longevity is founded on what Said terms its strategy of flexible positional superiority. As a result of this strategy, it is possible to have series of relationships and circumstances between the West and the Orient, in which the West always emerges superior. Said points to the historical circumstances that facilitated this assertion of superiority of culture, that of Europe's extraordinary ascendancy from the late Renaissance to the present. The economic and political situation of Europe and the Orient allowed diverse people to be present in the Orient and to speak about it, that is, to construct knowledge about it with very little resistance from the Orient itself. The linguistic appeal of Orientalism lies in the range of occupations, disciplines, and institutions it is able to catalogue in its examination of the complex, multi-layered formation of this field. The scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, or the soldier. A list of people that includes scientific and intellectual pursuits, religion, business, and the military. Occupations that are not usually seen in relation with each other as sharing common grounds. While it is known that the trader and the missionary were often followed by the soldier in the process of colonization, as with the East India Company, or that religion and business were given safe entry by the army in colonized areas, the idea that they all worked towards the common goal of orientalizing it is novel. Foucault's greatest intellectual contribution is to an understanding of how the appetite for or will to exercise dominant control in society and history has also discovered a way to clothe, disguise, rarefy, and wrap itself systematically in the language of truth, discipline, rationality, utilitarian value, and knowledge. But Foucault seems unaware of the extent to which the ideas of discourse and discipline are assertively European, and how, along with the use of discipline to employ masses of detail and of human beings, discipline was used also to administer, study, reconstruct, and then subsequently to occupy, rule, and exploit almost the whole of the non-European world. This dimension is wholly absent from Foucault's work, even though his work helps one to understand it. Since it strikes one as being a definitive part of modern history, some account of this European hegemony over the world needs to be taken. Edward Said's canonical texts, Orientalism, After the Last Sky, Culture and Imperialism, charts the worldly discourse of colonial and post-colonial discourses of stereotype, otherness and foreignness as they are established in the imaginative and institutional archives of empire. Said's critical power lies in revealing strategies of affiliation through which the abject subject, be it a person, a group, or a body of texts, can encounter the freedom of agency and interpretation, thereby fulfilling the mission of secular humanism. In many ways, Edward Said's words remain today as vital and vibrant as they were when written in 1978. His book, published that same year, Orientalism, offers a timeless historical analysis of the way in which the scholars, writers, and specialists of the Orient created an imaginary of the Oriental and later the Arab, which served to help shape their own identity as Europeans, to justify their imperial conquests, and to help them control and dominate the colonies. Said's writings analyze the way that knowledge operates as a cultural tool and a political weapon. Knowledge, Said argued, has material effects of reality. It shapes the conception of self and of the other, and it does so through a back and forth, a mutually constitutive act that constructs an idea of the other as it shapes a conception of the self. European culture thrived on the epistemological construction of the Orient. In Said's words, European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. Building on but simultaneously against Nietzsche's views of truth as illusions and Foucault's theory of knowledge power, Said crafted a sharp critique of the West and of Western critical theory, as dependent on this recurring othering of Orientals and Arabs. Truths are illusions that we have forgotten are illusions. These famous words may sound too nihilistic to some, Said emphasized, but those words of Nietzsche draw attention to the fact that so far as it existed in the West's awareness, the Orient was a word which later accrued to it a wide field of meanings, associations and connotations, and that these did not necessarily refer to the real Orient but to the field surrounding the word. Yes, indeed, that was true of the Orient for Europeans, especially, and tragically, it is equally true today for the construction of the category of Muslims for many Americans. One can hardly imagine in the current political climate in the United States a timelier critical intervention than Said's writings on Orientalism as a way to capture the demonization of Muslims today, as well as Latinos and immigrants, as a vehicle to reproduce an imaginary American identity. When a Republican presidential candidate, later President of the United States, declares that Islam hates us and that we have a problem in this country, it's called Muslims, we are right back smack in the middle of Said's writings on Orientalism. So much so, in fact, that in this seminar series that we have been discussing for so long, it is to dedicate in actualizing and deploying critical texts, so much so that it is almost as if Said's writings on Orientalism are too fresh to need rejuvenation. Said presciently foresaw how the Arab Muslim would become a key trope in American culture, government and public policy. Muslims, Said predicted, would be viewed more and more as increasingly menacing, bloodthirsty and dishonest in our new geopolitical configuration. It is almost as if Said foresaw, writing in 1978, the tragic aftermath of 9/11. It is almost as if he prophesied our new counterinsurgency warfare paradigm of governing built on the fabrication from whole cloth of internal enemies, what one calls the counter-revolution. To be sure, Said's book Orientalism provoked criticism. Some historians challenged the implications of his work on how to understand the well-intentioned and painstaking labor of many erudite and truth-seeking Orientalist scholars. Others accused Said of a form of Occidentalism, but those controversies are of little interest today. However, one must always reflect on praxis. Orientalism itself not so much on praxis as with epistemology. If this book has any further use, if it has any future use, Said concluded in 1978, it will be as a modest contribution to the challenge to the worldwide hegemony of Orientalism, and as a warning that systems of thought like Orientalism, discourses of power, ideological fictions, mind-forged manacles are all too easily made, applied, and guarded. If the knowledge of Orientalism has any meaning, it is in being a reminder of the seductive degradation of knowledge anywhere at any time. Now perhaps more than before. Now perhaps more than ever, one might say today. But what does one do exactly with that knowledge? To be sure, the critical unveiling is itself a form of praxis, but it must also serve as a prolegomena to praxis. How can we deploy a rethink today for our contemporary political struggles? The many insights that we discover in Said's writings. To go on to the critique of Orientalism, there were two early critiques that were compiled against the arguments that were placed by Said. Said's argument attracted some attention in the early years after Orientalism appeared, most pointedly in Sadiq Jalal al-Azm's biting critique in Khamsin, and then in Ejaz Ahmad's broadside in his book In Theory. As al-Azm correctly observed, Said's argument was not only in tension with but also fatally undermined his objective of criticizing Orientalist views of modern history. For to say as Said did, that Orientalism had been the defining element in the Western constructions of the East without attributing it to any social or institutional matrix, strongly suggested that Orientalism was in some way part of the enduring cognitive apparatus of the West. It led inexorably to the conclusion, al-Azm suggested, that Orientalism is not really a thoroughly modern phenomena, but is the natural product of an ancient and almost irresistible European bent of mind to misrepresent the realities of other cultures, peoples, and their languages in favor of Occidental self-affirmation. But if this is what Said was saying, then did it not resurrect the very Orientalism he disavowed? A defining characteristic of this worldview, after all, was the idea of an ontological chasm separating East and West, which the fields, categories, and theories emanating from the West could not traverse. The Western mind, in other words, was not capable of apprehending the true nature of Eastern culture. Said's implantation of Orientalist discourse as an unchanging component of Western culture seemed to reinforce this very idea of the inscrutability of the Orient to Western eyes, from the Greeks to Henry Kissinger. The same questions about Said's argument were raised by Ejaz Ahmad in a landmark assessment of his broader over, published almost a decade after al-Azm's review. Ahmad speculated that Said's second rendering of the connection between Orientalism and colonialism was perhaps attributable to the influence of Foucault, though for Ahmad it was questionable whether Foucault would have supported the idea of a putative continuity in Western discourse from Homer to Richard Nixon. The critical problem for Ahmad, however, was not Said's fidelity to Foucault, but the theoretical and political consequences of locating Orientalism in the deep recesses of Western culture, rather than among the consequences of colonialism. Ahmad raised two issues in particular. First, Said seemed to take the Orientalist mindset to be so pervasive in scope and so powerful in influence that the possibility of escaping its grip appeared exceedingly remote. Hence, even thinkers known to be fierce critics of British colonialism are blandly assimilated into the rogues gallery of European Orientalists. The most prominent figure in this regard is Karl Marx, who Said relegates to this ignominious status with only the flimsiest of explanations. Ahmad's foregrounding of this issue was surely justified, given the leading role that Marx and his followers had played, not only in criticizing the racism of colonial apologists, but also in anti-colonial movements, from Ireland to India and from Tanzania to Said's own homeland of Palestine. Ahmad pointed out again correctly that the very passages Said singled out as instances of cultural parochialism could easily be read in a very different vein as describing not the superiority of Western culture but the brutality of colonial rule. In any case, regardless of one's judgment about Marx, what was at issue here was whether Said could justifiably claim that Orientalism not only stretched back to classical Greece, but exercised such power as to absorb even its critics. Further, Ahmed pointed out to a second equally important implication of the analysis. Said's argument as well as his vocabulary pushed strongly to displace the traditional interest-based explanations for colonialism and toward one relying on civilizational clashes. Conventional accounts of colonial expansion had typically adverted to the role of interest groups, classes, and state managers as its animating force. For Marxists, it had been capitalists. For nationalists, it had been British interests. For liberals, it was overly ambitious political leaders. What all these explanations had in common was the central role that they accorded to material interests as the motivating factor in colonial rule. But if in fact Orientalism as a body of thought propels its believers toward the accumulation of territories, then it is not interests that drive the project but a deeply rooted cultural disposition, a discourse to put it in contemporary jargon. As Ahmed concludes, the idea of constituting identity through difference points again not to the realm of political economy, wherein colonization may be seen as a process of capitalist accumulation, but to a necessity which arises within discourse and has always been there at the origin of discourse, so that not only is the modern Orientalist presumably already there in Dante and Euripides, but modern imperialism itself appears to be an effect that arises as if naturally from the necessary practices of discourse. Ahmed is registering his agreement with Al-Azam's judgment that Said has reversed the causal arrow that normally went from colonialism to Orientalism. Naturally, this means that the study of this phenomenon moves from the ambit of political economy to cultural history. But it is not just that colonial expansion appears to be an artifact of discourse. The dispositions it comprises are placed by him not in a particular region or historical era, but in an undifferentiated entity known as the West, stretching back 2 millennia. This is, of course, a classically Orientalist assertion on Said's part, but its implications for the study of colonialism are profound. For colonialism now appears not as the consequence of developments particular to a certain era, but as an expression of a deeper ontological divide between East and West, a symptom of the cultural orientation of Europe's inhabitants. We have gone from the culprit being British capitalists to its being the West, from classes to cultures. Said never addressed either Al-Azam's or Ahmed's criticisms, a shame because they remain among the most important and devastating engagements with his work to date. In a private exchange with Al-Azam, he promised to reply at some length, and indeed to dismantle Al-Azam's entire examination point by point. But he never delivered on that promise, nor did he respond in print to Ahmed's critique.